Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
October 22nd, 1962. With these words, President John F. Kennedy establishes the missiles on Cuba as a Soviet threat against the U.S., plunging the nation into a 13-day crisis that brought the world to the brink of a nuclear war. But modern historians disagree on exactly what this crisis represents. Was it a triumph of hardline foreign policy or a political cover-up? What did this crisis mean for people outside the U.S.? And who, ultimately, is responsible for the outbreak of the crisis?
The fact of the matter is this. In placing the missiles on Cuba, the Soviets were attempting to reestablish their political prestige and power, and to also test the American determination and will. And after the blunder of the Bay of Pigs incident, Kennedy was in no position to back down. It is thanks to Kennedy's cool-headedness and resolve that nuclear fallout was avoided.
Well, that's a bunch of nonsense. Well, okay. I guess it's not completely fair. Before the government documents were released in the 90s, it made sense to view Kennedy as the peace-loving, war-avoiding leader that everyone perceives him to be. I mean, for a long time, the only history about the deliberations of the crisis were from the memoirs, which are not exactly the most accurate in their documentation. The truth of the matter is this. Kennedy has a large part to play in the onset of the crisis as a whole.
Allowing the Soviets to place missiles on Cuba would be an extremely large tactical and strategic error. First of all, allowing the Soviets to stockpile nuclear missiles on Cuba would have disrupted the nuclear balance entirely. Secondly, the missiles were at a distance that would prove disastrous for the U.S. The missiles were offensive, and they were going to strike first. If that occurred, the truth is, the U.S. would have been completely at a disadvantage.
Okay, let's get something straight. The missile gap, the balance of the amount of nuclear arms was in favor of the U.S. If you look at the government documents from the time, the U.S. had 6 times as many ICBMs, 10 times as many long-range bombers, 9 times as many nuclear warheads, and twice as many SLBMs. The USSR didn't stand a chance if it came to it.
Kennedy's response to the missiles on Cuba was to enact quarantine. It was crucial that it was labeled a quarantine and not a blockade, because that would be violating international law. Also, the term blockade in itself is a war term, and you did not want that. All in all, the move was strategically brilliant. It allowed the U.S. the ability to call all the shots and place Khrushchev in the position where any military action would be precipitated by him.
I guess the question comes down to, why did the Kennedy administration take this course of action?
You know, that's a good question. Again, it all comes back to the Bay of Pigs. Kennedy was blatantly humiliated by the event, and the animosity that he carried towards the Castro regime is still a big influence on his actions during the crisis.
Kennedy was elected based on a platform that the Eisenhower-Nixon administration was soft on communism. Kennedy had defined his administration as one firmly against Cuba. At this point, America's allies are also starting to view the U.S.'s fixation with Cuba as what it is, a fixation and obsession. At this point, the administration is really in peril. Thus, they acted the way they did because, as Assistant Secretary of State Edwin Martin explained, this psychological factor was more important than the direct threat.
For many years, the prevailing view was that the crisis was a win for the U.S. It was only when classified archives were released in the late 1980s that the American public discovered the full story. Khrushchev had publicly demanded that the U.S. missiles be removed from Turkey, but privately offered Kennedy a deal. If the U.S. promised to stay out of Cuba, the USSR would remove its missiles. Kennedy publicly accepted Khrushchev's deal and secretly removed the missiles from Turkey.
So what is the general view of how Kennedy acted in the face of a nuclear crisis?
Well, I mean, it was his finest work yet, and everyone could agree. He was neither reckless nor afraid. He was the perfect combination of toughness, restraint, and determination. He always had been one for exercising wisdom, analysis, and strategy, but this, I mean, he was not only acting as a leader, but he was acting as a hero.
Revisionist scholars, however, note the dangerous impact Kennedy's approach to the crisis has had on American foreign policy.
It is esoteric strategizing, this misplaced obsession with credibility, this dangerously expansive concept of what constitutes security, which has afflicted both Democrats and Republican administrations, and both liberals and conservatives. It is a stance toward the world that can easily doom the United States to military commitments and interventions in strategically insignificant places over intrinsically trivial issues.
The study of this crisis focuses almost exclusively on the actions and effects of a few major players. But what did the crisis mean for everyday life, not only in the US, but all over the world?
What would you say were the main causes of the crisis?
I would say that the Cuban Revolution, which ended right as I was born, was a causal factor. It helped Castro rise to power, which threatened business in the United States.
While living in Cuba as a child, did you understand anything about the crisis? Did you have any ideas as to who was behind it and why it was happening?
It was always Fidel. It was all about whether or not the United States wanted to support and protect the Cuban people, and where the balance of power would land.
Castro himself became disillusioned with the USSR after they gave in to US demands and removed the missiles. Though Cuba maintained close economic ties with the USSR, Castro increasingly pursued an independent revolutionary strategy. Cuban soldiers, doctors, and teachers were sent to aid independence movements throughout Africa and Latin America.
What do you consider to be the biggest American misconception about the Cuban Missile Crisis?
The biggest misconception from America was that the crisis was about defending Cuba against possible invasions from other countries. These broader implications are theories that have nothing to do with reality.
What effects did this have on Russia, and what should people take away from the crisis?
Negotiation is key. That is the main takeaway. As soon as you explain to people where you're coming from, you can impose your influence upon them. You negotiate with your enemies, not your friends.
This policy of negotiation continued as US-Soviet tensions lessened during the intervening years. In 1963, Kennedy and Khrushchev signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It symbolized a step toward peace and a de-escalation of the arms race.